Korean Mafia boss forced his wife to kneel before his mistress. 4 years later, his twins call another man Papa. 2 drawings. That's what brought the most feared man in Busan's underworld to a complete standstill. Not a rival's bullet. Not a prosecutor's warrant. Not the 30 men who'd spent 4 years trying to dismantle his empire. 2 drawings. 2 small hands stretching upward, each holding a crayon portrait toward a gray-haired man on a wooden bench outside a Busan shopping center. Papa, mine is better. Papa, look. I drew you a house. Kang Seung-hyun stopped walking. His jaw didn't move. His hands that had ordered men to disappear without flinching, went completely still at his sides. Because those 2 children had his brow, his exact jaw, his mother's eyes, and they were 4 years old. 4 years old. Now do the math with me. 4 years ago, Kang Seung-hyun forced his wife, his pregnant wife, to kneel on cold marble floors in front of his mistress. He told her the marriage was a transaction. He told her she was nothing. He told her to disappear. She did. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. He knew. He simply did not care. But here is what he didn't know. She didn't lose the babies. She carried twins to full term. Alone. In silence. With no name listed for the father. And the man those children are now calling Papa? He's been there since the beginning. For years. Every morning. Every scraped knee. Every drawing proudly held up with both hands. That's all it took for Kang Seung-hyun to be completely, quietly, surgically replaced. And the woman standing behind those children. Calm, unhurried. Holding a reusable grocery bag like a woman who has never once looked over her shoulder in fear. That's Seo-hyun, his ex-wife. She hasn't looked at him yet, but she will. If you're already gripped, subscribe right now and hit that bell, because this story does not end where you think it ends. The real question isn't why she left. You already know why she left. The real question is, what did Kang Seung-hyun do when he realized the old man wasn't just helping? He was their father. In every way that mattered. The shopping center on the edge of Busan on a Wednesday afternoon was the kind of place that asked nothing of you. Modest storefronts. Families moving slowly between errands. A food court that smelled of soy broth and sesame. Elderly couples sharing benches near the entrance fountain. Children running ahead of parents who were too tired to chase them. It was invisible. Deliberately, peacefully invisible. Kang Seung-hyun moved through it the way he moved through everything, like the space had already decided to make room for him before he arrived. Tailored black coat. No bodyguard today, just one advisor walking half a step behind. He had come for a brief, quiet meeting with a logistics contact on the upper level. Routine. He was crossing the atrium when routine ended. 2 children, identical in the way that only genetics can engineer, were crouched near a low fountain, each holding a folded piece of paper. A boy and a girl. Same sharp brows. Same focused expression, the kind that pulled inward when something mattered. They were perhaps 4 years old. They were laughing the way children laugh when they've never heard a raised voice. The kind of laughter that doesn't know what fear is. They ran. Not to him. To a man on a bench. He was perhaps late 60s. Worn gray cardigan. Soft hands, the kind built by decades of honest work. Not violence. The kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and fixed things around the house without being asked. The kind of man Seung-hyun would once have looked straight through. Papa, I drew you a house. The boy thrust his drawing forward with both hands. Papa, mine is better, the girl added, tugging the old man's sleeve without apology. The old man laughed. A real laugh, unhurried, and crouched down to their level. Then I'll have to judge fairly, won't I? Seung-hyun's chest went completely still. Not his breathing. Not his posture. Something deeper. Because those 2 faces were a mirror held up to a photograph he hadn't thought about in years. A photograph his mother had taken of him at 4 years old, before everything in his life became about control. Same jaw. Same quiet intensity behind the eyes. Same way the brow pressed down when something felt important. His children. He didn't need confirmation. He didn't need a test. Everything biological in him had already decided. And then he saw her, standing 6 feet behind them. Seo-hyun. She was holding a canvas bag, vegetables, and a folded receipt visible at the top. She was watching the children with the easy, unguarded expression of a woman who had nowhere more important to be. She looked different. Not fragile the way she'd been in those last months of their marriage. Not the careful stillness of a woman calculating where the next blow was coming from. She looked rested, fed, like a woman who had learned to exist inside her own body without bracing. She looked healed. And that, not the children, not the old man, not even the word Papa still echoing in the atrium, that was the thing that broke something open inside Kang Seung-hyun. Because he could manage enemies. He had survived rivals, raids, betrayals, and courtrooms. But he had no framework, none, for the sight of a woman who was visibly, undeniably, completely better without him. He hadn't destroyed her. He had released her. And she had used every day of the 4 years since to build something he hadn't known was possible. A quiet life. This had been arranged. Seung-hyun set his phone on the kitchen counter and loosened his cufflink with the focused, unhurried motion of a man completing paperwork. He didn't look at her right away. When he finally did, his expression held nothing she could hold on to. No cruelty, no heat, not even contempt. Just distance. The specific distance of someone who has already made a decision and is now only performing its conclusion. "We need to be clear about something," he said. Seo-hyun said nothing. "This," he gestured once vaguely at the space between them, "was always a transaction. You understood that when you signed. I need you to understand it again now, so there's no confusion later." He said it the way you read a clause from a contract. Measured. Final. She looked at him for a long moment. Then at Mina, who hadn't moved from her position near the fireplace, watching with the particular stillness of someone enjoying a performance they'd requested. "Kneel," Seung-hyun said. The word landed without volume. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. In his world, the quieter the instruction, the more absolute its weight. Seo-hyun's hand tightened against her stomach. 1 second. 2. She hesitated. And in that hesitation, in that single pause between his command and her body, something shifted in her that had nothing to do with him. It moved through her quietly, the way a door closes in a house no one is watching. Not rage. Not grief. Something colder and more useful than either. Clarity. She looked at him one last time. At the marble floors. At Mina's expression. Satisfied, waiting, already composing the story she would tell. At the city below the glass, indifferent and enormous. At the man standing across from her, who had just reduced 4 years of her life to a transaction requiring formal closure. And she made a decision. Not to fight him. Not tonight. She knelt. Slowly, because her body was 8 months full of a life he had never once asked about. She lowered herself to the cold marble with both hands braced, and she felt the floor's chill move through her knees immediately. Sharp, clarifying. Mina said nothing. Seung-hyun said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He had wanted her reduced. She had let him believe it worked. Those were 2 entirely different things. She was gone before morning. No note. No confrontation. No final conversation designed to make him understand what he had done. She had no interest in making him understand anything. Understanding was a gift, and he had forfeited it on cold marble at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. She took almost nothing. A bag. Documents. The small amount of cash she had quietly, patiently set aside over the course of months, because somewhere in the back of her mind, in a place she hadn't fully admitted to herself until tonight, she had already known this was coming. She had just been waiting to be certain. Now she was. Seung-hyun noticed she was gone by mid-morning. He made 2 calls. Neither was to find her. The first was to confirm she had left the building. The second was to ensure her access codes had been deactivated. That was all. He assumed the baby had been lost. The stress of it, the disappearance, the circumstances, these things happened. He filed it somewhere behind the ports and the contracts and the 11 other things that required his attention before noon, and he did not return to it. He had not built an empire by lingering on loose ends. She was gone. The transaction was closed. He moved on. He would spend the next 4 years believing that. He was wrong about almost everything. Seung-hyun did not fall apart in the atrium. That was not how he was built. He stood in the center of that shopping center for perhaps 40 seconds after Seo-hyun turned away, long enough for his advisor to understand that something significant had occurred, not long enough for anyone passing to notice. Then he straightened his coat, turned from the fountain, and walked back to the car. He said nothing on the ride home. He didn't need to speak. By the time the car reached the first intersection, his advisor had already taken out a phone. "I need a full intelligence pull," Seung-hyun said finally, when they were 3 minutes from the building. "The woman, the children, the old man, everything. 48 hours. His advisor nodded once and said nothing further. That was the thing about working for Seung-hyun. You learned very quickly that most of what he communicated wasn't contained in his words. The dossier arrived in 31 hours. Seung-hyun read it at his desk, alone, at just past 2 in the morning. No overhead light, just the focused beam of the lamp and the particular silence of a building at that hour, when even the city outside seemed to be holding its breath. He read it twice. Seo-hyun. She lived in a modest neighborhood on the southwestern edge of Busan. A rented house, small, maintained, nothing remarkable from the outside. She worked 3 mornings a week at a small alterations and tailoring shop 4 streets away, close enough to walk. Her finances were modest and entirely her own. No debt, no assistance, no connection to anyone from her previous life. She had not looked back. Not once. Jiho and Era, the twins, 4 years old, enrolled in a small preschool 8 minutes from the house, the kind of place with painted handprints on the walls and mismatched chairs in the reading corner. Healthy, developmentally normal. Teacher's notes, obtained through channels that did not require explanation, described Jiho as focused and unusually deliberate for his age. Era was described as quick, socially confident, and, in the words of one report, a natural negotiator. Both birth certificates listed the father's line as blank. Not unknown. Blank. Intentional. Seung-hyun looked at that detail for a long time before turning the page. Byung-chul. Age 67. Retired carpenter. Former landlord. Seo-hyun had rented the house from him when she first arrived in the neighborhood, nearly 4 years ago. Widower. 1 adult daughter living in Incheon, visited twice a year. No criminal record. No financial entanglements. No romantic history with Seo-hyun. The surveillance was thorough enough that this could be stated with certainty. He had simply never left. The report laid it out in plain language, the way intelligence reports do, stripped of interpretation. Subject maintains daily presence in the household. Provides childcare during work hours. Prepares meals. Transports children to and from preschool. Attends school events. Has been referred to as Papa by both children since approximately age 2. Seung-hyun set the page down. Picked it up again. Read that last line one more time. Has been referred to as Papa by both children since approximately age 2. He had expected something he could categorize. A man with leverage. A man with an angle. Someone who had found her in a vulnerable moment and positioned himself deliberately. That, at least, would have made sense. That was a language Seung-hyun understood fluently. But this? A retired carpenter. A former landlord. A man who stayed because he wanted to. A man who showed up every morning because the children needed someone to show up every morning. And he was simply there, and he kept being there, and after enough mornings it had become the only truth those children knew. He hadn't replaced Seung-hyun with power. He hadn't replaced him with money, or influence, or anything that could be contested or dismantled. He had replaced him with consistency, with presence. With 4 years of ordinary mornings that Seung-hyun had spent running ports and signing orders and never once thinking about 2 people, and then 2 more people, who existed in a house on the southwestern edge of the city without his name anywhere near them. He closed the dossier, sat in the silence for a long time. Then he spoke. "No contact," he said. His advisor, seated across the room, looked up carefully. "Sir." "No contact," Seung-hyun repeated, quieter this time, final in a different way than his instructions usually were, not the finality of authority but something heavier. "None. From anyone. From me. From this organization. from anyone connected to me in any direction. A pause. Understood. And the children? Seung-hyun was quiet for a moment. They're protected, he said, quietly, rotating. Nothing visible, nothing that touches their routine. They don't see it. She doesn't see it. His advisor wrote it down without comment. And if she finds out? Seung-hyun picked up his pen and returned his attention to the papers on his desk. She won't, he said. That's the point. He told himself it was strategy. He told himself it was practical, loose ends, liability management, the kind of quiet order that held an empire together. He almost believed it, but the dossier stayed on his desk. For 3 days. He didn't file it. He didn't destroy it. He just left it there, closed in the lamplight, next to a blank line on a birth certificate that had been the loudest thing he'd read in 4 years. He told himself it was surveillance. That was the word he used internally, the clean, operational word that kept the activity at a professional distance. Surveillance. Information gathering. Situational awareness. The kind of language that transformed an action into a function, a feeling into a protocol. It held for approximately 4 days. The school run happened at 8:15 every morning. Byung-chul walked them, always the same route, out the front gate, left at the corner with the persimmon tree, straight down the gentle slope toward the low yellow building with the painted handprints above the entrance. Ji-ho walked on his left. Era walked on his right or didn't walk so much as moved in interrupted bursts. 3 steps forward, a pause to examine something on the ground, 2 steps sideways, then back into formation as if she'd never left. Seung-hyun watched this from a parked car on the parallel street, twice removed from their route. He watched it on a Tuesday, then again on a Wednesday, then the following Monday because the weekend had produced a restlessness he didn't have vocabulary for and returning to the routine of it. The simple, undemanding fact of knowing they were there and safe was the only thing that settled it. He did not examine this too closely. There was a small park 4 streets from the house. Byung-chul brought them on afternoons when the weather allowed, which in that part of autumn was most afternoons. He would sit on the same bench each time, a thermos of something warm beside him, and watch them with the patient, alert attention of a man who had nowhere more important to be and had long since made peace with that. Ji-ho liked the climbing frame. He approached it with the same focused deliberateness the preschool report had noted, studying the structure briefly before committing, then moving through it with quiet precision. No performance. No checking whether anyone was watching. Era liked the swings. She liked them loudest. Head back, legs pumping, demanding more height with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been told to make herself smaller. Higher. Harabiaji. Higher. Byung-chul would push and complain cheerfully about his back, and push harder anyway. Seung-hyun sat in the car and watched a man pretend his back hurt so a 4-year-old girl would laugh. He sat there for a long time after they'd gone home. What fractured him wasn't the big moments. He had expected, in some part of himself, that the difficult thing would be something dramatic, a scene he could process as a single event and then file away. The mind prefers clean breaks, discrete wounds. But it wasn't like that. It was the small things accumulated. The way Ji-ho reached up without thinking to hold Byung-chul's hand when a loud truck passed on the road beside the park. The automatic reach, not fear, just comfort-seeking, the reflex of a child who had learned that a hand would always be there. The way Byung-chul's hand came down to meet it without him looking, without interrupting whatever he'd been saying, as if the connection between them was so established it didn't require attention. It was the way Seo-yeon looked on the evenings she met them at the park gate. She had changed her hours at the tailoring shop to finish by 4 on Thursdays. Seung-hyun knew this because he had learned her schedule the way you learn a language, slowly through repetition, until the pattern became something you carried without effort. She would appear at the gate with her canvas bag and the easy expression of a woman arriving somewhere she actually wanted to be, and the children would run to her with the full-bodied abandon of people who have never had a reason to hold back. She looked well. Not performing wellness, not the careful brightness of someone reassembling themselves for an audience. Just genuinely, quietly well. The kind of well that comes from sleeping through the night for 1,000 consecutive nights. From eating meals without calculating the mood of the room first. from existing in a body that had been allowed, over for slow years, to stop bracing. He recognized what it was because he had been its cause. The absence of him had done that. He sat with that knowledge in the car, in the park, on the parallel street, in the lamplight at 2 in the morning over a dossier that never moved from his desk. And he sat with it without deflecting it, which was the most honest thing he had done in years. It was a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week when he almost crossed the street. Era had drifted, the way she sometimes did, pulled sideways by something only she could see, and for a moment she was 10 feet from Byung-chul, crouched near the park's low boundary wall, examining something in the grass with complete absorption. She was close. Closer to Seung-hyun's side of the street than she'd ever been. He was out of the car before he'd decided to move. Standing on the pavement, 8 meters of open space between them. She was small and focused and entirely unaware of him, her dark hair falling forward, her small shoulders rounded over whatever she'd found. His foot moved, 1 step forward, and then Byung-chul called her name. Soft, unhurried.
Arakya.
Come show me. She stood immediately, dropped whatever she'd found and ran back across the grass, already talking before she reached him. Seung-hyun stood on the pavement. He didn't take the second step. He stayed there until they left the park. Then he walked back to the car, sat down, closed the door, said nothing to his advisor. His advisor said nothing back. That night, Seung-hyun sat at his desk for a long time without turning on the lamp. In the dark, for the first time in 4 years, possibly longer, he allowed himself one clear thought. He had no idea how to be someone's father. He wasn't sure he ever had. Jae-hyun had learned patience the hard way. Not the passive patience of a man who waited because he had no other option, but the active, architectural kind. The patience of someone who understood that the most dangerous structures don't collapse when you strike them. They collapse when you remove the right foundation stone, quietly, and then simply wait for gravity to finish the work. He had been building toward Kang Seung-hyun for 3 years. 3 years of paper trails and port manifests and shell company registrations that looped back on themselves like deliberately tangled thread. 3 years of witnesses who remembered nothing, informants who disappeared before depositions, and evidence that was always 1 clean step removed from anything prosecutable. Seung-hyun was careful, meticulous. The kind of man who understood that the law was not his enemy so long as he never gave it anything solid to grip. Jae-hyun respected that. He also intended to dismantle it completely. The children appeared in a routine surveillance cross-reference. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of discovery that happened in the margins of larger work. A flag generated by a junior analyst running background checks on individuals in Seung-hyun's monitored personal history. Seo-hyun's name had been in the file for 2 years, listed as former spouse, status, whereabouts unknown, assessed low priority. The reassessment came when the analyst found the birth registration. Twins, 4 years old. Mother, Seo-hyun. Father, unlisted. The analyst flagged it as a potential personal connection. Jae-hyun read the flag on a Tuesday morning between 2 other reports and set it aside. Then picked it up again an hour later. Then called the analyst back in and asked for a full pull on the children's records. He read those records that evening in his office, alone, with the particular focused stillness that his colleagues had learned meant something significant was forming. He read them twice. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The vulnerability was elegant in its simplicity. The children were unregistered to their father. They existed legally in a space with no connection to Kang Seung-hyun, which meant they were also without the protections his infrastructure would otherwise extend. They were a single mother's children, living modestly on the southwestern edge of Busan, entirely exposed to the ordinary mechanisms of civil law.
No fortress.
No legal architecture, no layer of distance, just a woman, 2 children, and a blank line on a birth certificate. Jae-hyun understood immediately that Seung-hyun would not have left that exposure by accident, which meant either he didn't know, or he knew and had chosen, for reasons that hadn't yet surfaced, to leave it untouched. Either way, it was a door, and Jae-hyun was very good at doors. The legal strategy took 11 days to construct. A custody investigation, formally initiated on grounds of child welfare, specifically the absence of paternal identification and the question of financial provision for minors, potentially connected to an individual under active criminal scrutiny. The language was careful, procedurally sound, and entirely defensible on its face. It was also, from the first filing to the last comma, a weapon. The mechanism was straightforward: force a paternity determination. Once Seung-hyun was legally established as the father, which biology would confirm without difficulty, his assets became subject to child support assessment. Child support assessment meant financial disclosure. Financial disclosure, under the specific provisions Jae-hyun had spent 3 years learning to apply, meant opening doors that had been welded shut for a decade. Not a raid. Not a criminal charge that could be appealed, delayed, or buried. A civil proceeding. Quiet. Procedural. Unstoppable. The kind of mechanism that didn't require a single witness to hold their nerve. The first notice arrived at Seo-hyun's address on a Thursday morning. She would have opened it without knowing what it was. An official envelope formally addressed, the kind that looked like it could be anything from a tax query to a school enrollment confirmation. She would have read the first paragraph standing in her kitchen, probably, with the canvas bag still on the counter from the morning school run. Jae-hyun knew this because his team had confirmed delivery. He didn't think about her particularly. She was a variable significant enough to require management, not significant enough to occupy more than a paragraph of his actual attention. She was the mechanism's entry point, not its target. She was collateral in the structural sense of the word. What happened to her in the process was a function of her proximity to the actual objective. Within 2 weeks, the filings had multiplied. Supporting documentation requests, a welfare assessment scheduled through family court, a notice to the preschool requesting attendance and behavioral records. Each document individually reasonable. Collectively, a wall being built around a single mother and 2 4-year-olds, not to protect them, but to use them as leverage points in a structure designed to bring down something entirely separate. Jae-hyun reviewed the case file on the evening the final preliminary filing was submitted. He closed it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had identified the correct stone. This was never about Ji-ho and Era. It was never about Seo-hyun. It was never about a blank line on a birth certificate or the welfare of 2 children in a small house on the edge of the city. It was about Kang Seung-hyun. About the 3 years of closed doors and vanishing witnesses and evidence that never quite landed. About finding the one thing his empire hadn't been built to protect. And destroying him through it. It was an ordinary afternoon. That was the part he would return to afterward, the complete ordinariness of it. No particular weight to the day. No significance in the weather, which was mild and pale, the kind of autumn afternoon that asks nothing of anyone. The park was half full in the way it usually was at that hour. A woman with a stroller moving slowly along the outer path, 2 older men playing paduk at the stone table near the entrance, a group of children from a nearby preschool releasing the compressed energy of a school day across the grass with focused, joyful chaos. Ji-ho and Era were among them. Seung-hyun was in his usual position, parked on the far side of the street, window lowered 2 inches, far enough to be invisible, close enough that the gap between them was measurable in meters he had memorized without meaning to. Byung-chul was on the bench. Same thermos, same patient, unhurried quality of attention, present without hovering, watching without managing. The particular posture of someone who had learned that children needed to be seen, not supervised. Era was on the climbing frame. She had been on it for 20 minutes, working through a route she had apparently decided on internally, and was now executing with the absolute concentration of someone completing an important project. Up the left side, across the middle bar, down the right but not all the way, pause, reverse, cross the middle again. Seung-hyun had watched her repeat the sequence 3 times without fully understanding what she was trying to achieve, and had found himself watching with something close to recognition. The focused intensity, the private logic, the complete indifference to whether anyone else understood the system. He knew that. It lived in him too. He had never considered, until these weeks of watching, that it might have traveled. She fell on the 4th attempt. Not dramatically. Not the kind of fall that produces screams or silence, just a small miscalculation at the base of the right side, a foot that landed half off the edge of the lower rung, and then the ordinary physics of a small body losing its balance. She went down sideways onto the rubber matting, landed on her hip and one palm, and the sound she made was the brief, surprised cry of someone registering an indignity rather than genuine pain. Seung-hyun was out of the car. He didn't decide to move. Movement simply happened. A direct, unmediated line from the sound of her cry to his body already in motion, stepping off the pavement, crossing the street, hand half extended toward a child who did not know he existed. He crossed half the distance before he stopped. He stopped because Byung-chul was already there. The old man moved with a speed that belied the thermos and the bench and the general impression of unhurried stillness. He was crouching beside Era before the last note of her cry had finished, one hand gentle on her back, the other checking her palm with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that the assessment was automatic. "Let me see," he said, calm, low, entirely steady. Era showed him her palm. A small red patch. Nothing broken. "Brave girl," Byung-chul said, not performatively. Not the loud, compensatory praise of someone trying to stop tears before they started. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered at close range, like something she was entitled to know about herself. She looked at her palm, then at him. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied with this assessment, and let him help her to her feet. "Again?" he asked. "Again," she confirmed. He walked her back to the climbing frame. She started from the beginning. He returned to the bench. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 40 seconds. Seung-hyun stood in the middle of the grass. No one looked at him. Why would they? He was a man standing very still in a park, which was not remarkable, and his stillness had the quality of someone in a private moment that the world around him had correctly identified as none of its business. His hand was still half raised. He looked at it, then lowered it. The feeling moving through him was not what he would have predicted. He had enough self-knowledge by this point to have anticipated jealousy, the territorial, combustible kind that his nature was capable of. He had anticipated something operational, some part of him calculating displacement and leverage and the question of what could be contested. There was none of that. What there was instead was something quieter and far more difficult to manage. Understanding. Clear, unambiguous, and entirely unwelcome. Byung-chul had not taken anything from him. There had been nothing to take. You could not displace a presence that had never existed. You could not replace a father who had never shown up. The old man on the bench with the thermos and the gentle hands had not arrived and removed Seung-hyun from the picture. He had simply walked into an empty frame, and stayed, and kept staying, every morning, every afternoon, every small fall and every crayon drawing and every negotiation over whose artwork was more impressive, while Seung-hyun ran ports, while Seung-hyun signed orders, while Seung-hyun stood across the city from his own children and told himself the distance was someone else's fault. He walked back to the car, sat down, looked at the park through the windshield until Byung-chul gathered the children and turned toward home. He hadn't been replaced by force. He hadn't been replaced by strategy or money or a man with more power. He had been replaced by presence, by someone who simply showed up, every single day, when Seung-hyun did not. His phone rang at 9:47 on a Tuesday evening. Unknown number. Busan prefix. He would have ignored it. He ignored most things that arrived without announcement, but something made him pick up on the second ring. A quality of timing, perhaps. The specific weight of a silence that preceded the call, as if the night had been building toward it. "I know you've been watching us." Seo-yun's voice, for years older, steadier than he remembered. The particular steadiness of someone who had rehearsed nothing because they no longer needed to. Seung-hyun said nothing for a moment. Then, "Seo-yun." "Don't," she said. One word. Flat. Not hostile, just precise. The tone of a woman who had identified exactly how much space she was willing to give this conversation, and had already drawn the boundary before dialing. "All right," he said. "You know about Jae-hyun." It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "Then you know what this is." "A mechanism," he said. "Civil proceeding. Paternity confirmation leads to financial disclosure. Financial disclosure opens the operations. A brief pause. He could hear her breathing, steady, controlled. He doesn't care about Jiho and Era, she said. You understand that. I understood it the day the first notice arrived. Then you understand that your continued existence, your name, your operations, any legal connection between you and those children, is what's keeping this moving. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. As long as you're reachable, they're a tool. The moment you become unreachable, the tool has no handle. Seung-hyun leaned back in his chair. Outside his window, the port lights were visible across the water. 30 years of work, reflected in the dark. He had looked at those lights 10,000 times and felt something close to satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a man surveying a thing he had built from nothing and made permanent. He looked at them now and felt something else entirely. You're asking me to dismantle everything, he said. I'm asking you to choose, she said. Your empire, or your children. The silence between them was the kind that contained more than either of them would say aloud. They don't know me, he said finally. Not a defense, just a fact stated plainly. No, she agreed. They don't. Then what exactly am I choosing between? Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her voice. Not softness. Not quite. More like the brief, involuntary acknowledgement of a question that deserved a real answer, even in this conversation. You're choosing whether they're safe, she said. You're choosing whether Jae-hyun gets to use them as entries in a financial disclosure file. You're choosing whether the life I built for them, without your name, without your money, without anything connected to what you are, survives what you've now made possible simply by existing near them. She paused. That's what you're choosing between. Not a relationship, not a role, just whether they're protected or exposed. Whether your presence in their proximity costs them something. Seung-hyun said nothing. You're good at disappearing people, she continued. You've done it for 30 years. I'm asking you to do it once more. The last time. Yourself. And if I don't, he said, quietly, testing the shape of it rather than genuinely resisting. Then Jae-hyun gets what he wants. The case proceeds. Your finances are opened. Your operations are dismantled through civil court, which is slower and more thorough than any criminal proceeding you've survived before. And Jiho and Era spend the next 2 years as exhibits in a legal process that was never about them. She stopped. I won't let that happen. You called me, he said, which means you believe I can stop it. I called you, she said, because I wanted to give you the opportunity to do one thing correctly. You've never had that before. I thought. She paused again. Something different in the pause this time. Something that cost her slightly more. I thought you might want it. Seung-hyun was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Not softer exactly, but lower. Stripped of the professional register he'd maintained for the first half of the call. My mother left when I was 6, he said. I don't know if you knew that. Pause from her side. She didn't say goodbye, he continued. She didn't leave a note. She was simply gone one morning, and no one explained it. And I spent a very long time afterward making sure I was never in a position where someone else's leaving could affect me. He looked at the port lights. I made you into something I could leave before you left me. I understand that now. It doesn't. He stopped. It doesn't change what I did. I'm not offering it as an explanation. Seo-hyun said nothing. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I built, he said, and what it cost. The silence held for several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was exactly as steady as it had been at the beginning of the call. But something in it acknowledged that she had heard him. Not forgiven, not softened, just heard. Then choose, she said. Your empire, a beat, or your children. The line stayed open for 4 seconds after she finished speaking. Then Seung-hyun set the phone down on the desk. He did not pick it up again that night. He sat in the lamplight until the port lights went dark. And when morning came, he already knew what he was going to do. He began on a Wednesday morning. No announcement. No final meeting where he gathered his people and explained the situation in terms designed to manage their reactions. No dramatic declaration. No burning of records. No symbolic gesture toward the life he was ending. He simply opened his laptop at 6 in the morning, made a call at 6:15, and by 7 o'clock the first thread had been pulled. Took 6 weeks. Later, the people who studied the dismantling of Kang Seung-hyun's organization, and there were people who studied it quietly in offices that had spent years trying to accomplish exactly this through other means, would remark on the absence of chaos. No internal war.
No hace sicher.
No public collapse that generated headlines and spectacle and the kind of visible downfall that satisfied certain narratives. Just a structure, methodically deconstructed from the inside by the only man who understood every load-bearing wall. The port contracts were the first to go, transferred legally and cleanly to subsidiary entities that had no traceable connection to him, restructured on paper as independent operations under management he had trusted for years. He released control without fanfare. The men running those operations received documents and instructions and asked no questions, because they had learned over many years that questions directed at Seung-hyun without invitation produced nothing useful. The properties followed, liquidated, transferred, or formally removed from any registration that carried his name. Some were donated to civic foundations through channels clean enough to survive scrutiny. Some were restructured into trusts with no beneficiary connected to him. One, the penthouse on the 47th floor, the marble and glass statement he had once surveyed with something close to pride, was sold in a private transaction for considerably below market value, to a buyer who asked nothing and was told nothing. He didn't watch it go. There was nothing to watch. The operations themselves, the ones that didn't exist on paper, the ones that had made his legitimate holdings possible, were dissolved with the same systematic precision he had once used to build them. Suppliers were released. Networks were quietly, carefully unwound. The men who had worked in those spaces were given severance through mechanisms that couldn't be traced and instructions that amounted to, "This chapter is closed, begin another." No one was left exposed. No one was handed to anyone. That was the one condition he held to throughout. The dismantling would not become a weapon against the people who had worked within it. It was the only line he drew. Everything else he erased. There was a night, in the 4th week, when he sat in what had been his office and looked at the walls. The desk was almost clear. The filing systems that had taken decades to build were gone. Properly gone, not relocated. The infrastructure of 30 years of careful, methodical power building had been reduced to a room with some furniture and a lamp and a man sitting alone in it, which was all it had ever really been. He sat there for a long time. He waited to feel something, loss, grief, the specific hollowness of a man who has just removed everything that defined him and discovered nothing underneath. What he felt instead was very quiet. Not peace. Not yet. Something more neutral than that. The particular stillness of a space that has been cleared and is waiting to become something else. The silence after a structure comes down, before anything new has been decided. He found he could breathe in it. That surprised him. He walked into Jae-hyun's office on a Thursday afternoon in the 6th week. Alone.
No advisor.
No legal counsel. They move, Ji-ho said, with the confidence of someone who had clearly already won this debate internally. Moving doesn't mean alive, Era told him. Buses move. Buses don't decide where to go. Neither do clouds. Byung-chul listened to all of it without arbitrating. Just walked. Let them work through the world at their own pace, which was the only kind of teaching that left no bruises. Seo-yun stood at the gate. She watched them go. Arms loosely crossed. A cup of something warm held against her chest. She looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere. Not a destination she'd planned, but the kind of place you reach after surviving a long detour and realize, quietly, is exactly where you were supposed to land. She looked rested. She looked like herself. She went back inside when they turned the corner. The gate clicked shut softly behind her. 30 meters back, Seung-hyun kept walking. He wore nothing that marked him. No coat that cost more than silence.
No bodyguards.
No weight of a name that opened doors because the name was gone now, dismantled carefully over 6 weeks, dissolved into paperwork and courtroom agreements and a prosecutor's handshake that tasted like surrender and felt, somehow, like the first honest thing he'd done in 20 years. He was just a man, walking. No one on this street knew what he had been. The woman who passed him with a stroller didn't flinch. The shop owner propping his sign against the wall didn't look twice. Seung-hyun had spent 2 decades constructing a presence that preceded him into every room, and now he was invisible. He was learning that invisibility was its own kind of weight. Up ahead, Era stopped. Not because of him. A bird, small, gray, the unimportant kind, had landed on the yellow fence and sat there with the serene indifference of a creature that had never been afraid of anything larger than itself. Era turned to look at it. In turning, her eyes swept the street behind her, past the woman with the stroller, past the shop owner, past the space between lamppost and wall where a man in plain clothes had stopped walking at the exact moment she looked. Her gaze passed over him, moved on. She turned back to the bird, said something to Ji-ho. He looked too. Byung-chul crouched down beside them both, pointing at something. The way the bird tilted its head, maybe, or the color under its wing. They watched it together. Then it flew, and they kept walking. Seung-hyun stood still for a moment longer than he needed to. There was a version of himself, the version that had existed 4 years ago, in the life before the marble floors and the silence in the prosecutor's office, that would have called that moment a wound. An insult. Evidence of something owed to him that had been stolen. That version of him would have moved closer, would have needed to be seen. He didn't move closer. He understood now, in the specific way that only comes after you have dismantled everything you thought made you untouchable, that her eyes passing over him without recognition was not cruelty. It was consequence. And consequence, unlike punishment, doesn't ask how you feel about it. It simply is. He had stood in a prosecutor's office and called it choosing. He was still choosing. Every morning, every 30 meters. Every time a small gray bird drew a child's eyes across the street and over a man she didn't know, and he let her look away, he started walking again. Parallel. At a distance that had no name except the one he'd given it in the quiet of an empty apartment on a Tuesday night several months ago, when he'd finally understood the difference between the things a man loses and the things a man earns. The children's voices floated back down the street. Still arguing. Clouds, probably. Or something new. It didn't matter. They were alive in a world that his absence had made safer, and that, he had decided, would have to be enough. It was